If you're a Christian who's struggling to process the whole aspect of suffering, then you need to watch this.
When I was a liberal and I fell away from the faith and I was embarrassed about my grandfather's and my grandmother's faithfulness, and I fell into the world and worldliness and the secular habits, I was miserable and I was angry at God. I was like, why me? Why couldn't I come from a rich family? Why couldn't I, have money? Why can't you make things easy? Now I realize, oh my gosh, it sounds ridiculous to say this. God's a genius, right? It sounds so ridiculous and patronizing to say God is a genius, but every single place that he put me, every bit of suffering, now when I speak on authority,
you
right?
Praise it. Yeah. George Jenko had a conversation with Candice Owens. I'm sure half of you know who she is and half of you don't know who she is. But if I were to simplify it, she is a conservative. She often has her views on politics. She often has views on culture. And at times she will speak about the faith. She often expresses her views against liberals, against politicians at the time, especially in America, of course. And this conversation she had with George Jenko, especially on this segment I'm about to play here, was very powerful. And I think many of you would benefit from hearing what she has to say. And of course, I'm going to give my own pointers and add my own commentary based on what she's saying.
Okay, let me give an example. This is a perfect example. There's this guy that I know. He came from a very wealthy family, drug addict.
Yeah, of course.
Threw away his life. And I looked at him and I go, what the heck is wrong with you, bro? God has blessed you with such a fruitful life and you throw it all away. And he says, you'll never understand what it feels like to never need to work for anything.
I actually fully subscribe to rich kid probs. They're real.
They're real.
They're real. I feel bad for rich kids because I'm like, wow, like I get that. Like you never had to
work for
learn.
Something.
You never had to work. And it's something that I am so conscious of with my children because I'm from the school of hard knocks. I had nothing. I had no money. I had over six figures in debt just trying to get to university because I felt the peer pressure to go, which is a joke. You do not have to go to university and get a degree. That is just already putting you into the banking system because you start your life already owing money and in debt. That's another evil in our society. But I think about this all the time, that they are, in a sense, handicapped by their own parents. I was friends with a girl and I had to bust my butt. I mean, I've had a job since I was 14 years old. I've never not had a job, and I have slept in my car. I've had $9 in my bank account. I remember crying on the phone with Sally Mae when they wouldn't stop calling me over student loans. And they were like, they just call back to back, it's totally mentally, they're just in you. Yeah. And they're just like, you're going to default on the loan. You're going to have a low credit score. You're not going to be able to live. We're going to take your first kid. And I just remember being on the phone talking to someone being like, what? I literally have $9 in my bank account. What would you like me to do? Yeah. Right? And I thank God for those moments, especially in the retrospect. In fact, thanking God in the retrospect is why I never doubt him now when I'm suffering, no matter what's going through, is because the lesson of my life, when I was a liberal and I fell away from the faith and I was embarrassed about my grandfather's and my grandmother's faithfulness, and I fell into the world and worldliness and the secular habits, I was miserable and I was angry at God. I was like, why me? Why couldn't I come from a rich family? Why couldn't I, have money? Why can't you make things easy? It turns you into a little Marxist, right? And then when I started going back to from where I started, what my grandfather's lessons were, what actually wealth is, because it isn't money, it's family, it's security, it's clear thinking, there were so many blessings in my life. And now I realize, oh my gosh, it sounds ridiculous to say this. God's a genius, right? It sounds so ridiculous and patronizing to say God is a genius, but every single place that he put me, every bit of suffering, now when I speak on authority,
you
right?
Praise it.
Yeah, I'm like, you are just so smart, God, you're a genius. Oh, I hate to say it's so patronizing to you, but you know it, And now when I can't make sense of things that are happening, when I'm like, why is this happening to me? Mosque shootings, types of, I'm like, I don't know what you're doing, God, but I know that you have me. I know that you're not putting me through the suffering. I will understand your perfect design and your plan later on. And I don't doubt him. I don't doubt him anymore.
This is very beautiful and this is very key. And I want to speak on this. I wanted to touch on this a bit. She's speaking about how she's thankful to God now, looking back on how difficult things were for her, and looking back she actually realizes that those sufferings were actually necessary for her to be in a position that she finds herself in today. And one thing that we've done in the Christian faith is that we have removed suffering as an aspect of true, genuine Christian faith. That we have removed the foundation of what actually makes Christianity. That Christianity is built upon suffering. If you consider the suffering of Christ on the cross and how he gave himself up for us, when the Bible speaks of how he did not consider himself equal to God, but humbled himself even to a point of death on the cross, that he ushered salvation through sheer suffering. And this is what our faith system is built upon, the suffering of Christ. And even if you consider the early church in the Bible, in the book of Acts, and when you look at some of the apostles and the prophets in the New Testament church, and even in the Old Testament, many of them suffered for the faith. For us to receive the gospel today in our convenience, in our comfortable spaces, people literally had to die. People literally had to be separated from their families so that me and you can enjoy the benefits of receiving the gospel. And when we removed this from the church, when you hear preachers today speak positive Christianity, God wants you to be happy, God is going to do it for you, and we remove the aspect of suffering, how we should deny ourselves, how we should be selfless in all things, how we should exalt the interests of others than our own interests, how we should be yielded, how we should be surrendered, how we should just be servants in all that we do. We don't emphasize that anymore, and that's why many Christians fall away, because their relationship with God is based on what He can do for them, not basically on who He is to them. When we remove suffering from the Christian faith, we remove the foundations in which no believer can build upon. And when Candice looks at her life, she's very thankful to God because she realized that many lessons came as a result of suffering. I know that if my upbringing was different than what it was, I wouldn't necessarily be here. I doubt I would have even come to the faith, met my wife, met amazing people in my life. But it had to take some of the saddening and not always exciting moments in my life for me to be the man that I am today. One thing about suffering is that it doesn't make sense in the present. You denying yourself today, you saying no, you're going to keep yourself pure, you saying no, you're not going to be found in those circles, you saying no, you're not going to take this job because there's an element of bribery required, there's an element of unethical behavior required, you saying no and preserving yourself today and allowing God to really keep you and nurture you in this present moment will make sense, not today, but in your future. And when you look back, you'll be thankful to God that you were able to make tough decisions then so that you can avoid tough situations in the present. Suffering is a huge element of our Christian faith.
God, he's very intentional. God is so intentional. And yeah, your suffering is intentional. You have to suffer. You have to go through suffering in life. That is a teaching moment for you. And when you make it through suffering, you will be so much stronger. And I think that because I was forged in the fire, a lot of this stuff just seems so ridiculous to me. When people are like, how do you deal with all the mean comments? I'm like, what a blessing. My grandfather had to get up when he was five years old and lay tobacco to dry on a sharecropping farm. I'm his granddaughter, and I got to deal with mean tweets on the internet. I'm spoiled.
They're misspelled too.
Yeah, I'm like, oh my gosh. Oh, my life is so hard. I'm like, everyone's like, how are you so happy? I'm like, because my life is wonderful. That's the pain I have to go through is an optional mean tweet. I don't have to be on Twitter. You know what I mean?
Right.
Who cares?
Dude, you fix your focus. Your perspective is perfect.
And this is beautiful, beautiful conversation. I would suggest that you guys go and check out the entire conversation. Of course, they're speaking about politics, culture, and very important topics of the day, but also I love the segment where she speaks about her faith, and also she speaks about how God often uses unfavorable situations and moments to mature us and grow us and perfect us in Him. And I think she's touching on something very important as well, that our desire not to suffer, our desire not to go through hard times and hard moments actually breeds and makes us people that are easily offended. We become people who cannot withstand tough times and at times cannot withstand the pressures of life. That a person, especially believers in the church again, they will be so much offended by something that happened in church, and as a result they would decide because of that they don't want anything to do with the faith anymore. These are sensitive Christians now. These are sensitive believers because God did not answer their prayer of getting a job or being married to that brother or being married to that sister, and things going a certain way, they leave the faith. And I will even go to this extent to say some of us sometimes struggle to still keep the faith when we pray prayers of God heal my mom, or God heal me, and God please don't take her, or God please preserve my mom, please preserve me, please preserve certain things in my life, and all these things just fall away. And it seems like all the moments we spent in prayer and asking God to come through were in vain and were wasted. Most of us would use that situation to say, you know what, I'm done with God. But this is not the perspective we see of the early church, of the early believers. Paul would probably be laughing at us to say, you guys are just offended by that one thing. You are so offended that God did not heal you, yet with me there was a thorn that came upon my flesh, and I pleaded with the Lord 3 times, Lord, please take this away from me. But the only thing God said was that His grace was sufficient. God did not heal Paul. God did not remove the thorn from Paul, but He just promised him that in that pain, in that season of his life, He will sustain him and He will keep him through His grace. And because we are Christians that do not value the power that that comes with suffering. We become Christians that easily fall away whenever insignificant struggles come upon our lives. And this is therefore building a generation of believers that won't be able to withstand Satan in times of difficulty and in moments of hardship. And I want you to consider someone who is training for a bodybuilding event, or someone who's going to run a marathon in the upcoming months. Those people have to deny themselves certain things that a normal person would easily indulge in. The person who's running a marathon in the coming weeks, the person who's training for a bodybuilding event, they have to eat certain foods that at times are not always tasty. They have to wake up at a certain time in which me and you might not be willing to wake up at that time. They might have to deny themselves certain privileges in which me and you can easily engage in and easily entertain. But most importantly, they must suffer. They must allow themselves to go through hard things. They must allow their bodies to be beaten up. They must allow their bodies to be disciplined for them to be in a place where they can be ready to compete. And one thing I know, and the Bible often speaks of this, that where there is greater suffering, there's often a greater reward. The Bible speaks of how the present sufferings cannot be compared to the greater glory that is to come. It teaches us that if we are able to withstand whatever it is that we have to withstand at this moment in time, that even though I'm going through the situation, but I know that God is going to bring me out of it. But not only is God going to eventually bring me out of it, but there's a greater reward awaiting me. There's a greater lesson awaiting me. There's a greater discipline. There's a greater attribute. There's a greater character trait that is awaiting me after all of this is said and done. And when we removed suffering from the church, and when we removed suffering from the message and the core message of Christianity, we started to see believers that were more motivated and encouraged by the word, more than were transformed and transfigured by the word. And this is why suffering is essential. It is a principle of life, and God even uses this principle to mature us in our faith walk. Don't despise what is it that you're going through. Always ask yourself, Lord, what is the greater lesson that you want me to learn from it? And I love what Candice is saying. When she looks back, she realizes that God was a genius, because every single thing she went through was necessary for her to be in a place where she is in today. And there's a story of this psychiatrist. His name was Viktor Frankl. I would actually advise that you read about him. And he was held prisoner by the German Nazi during World War. He was sitting there observing people. Of course, he was a psychiatrist, and he's sitting there observing people. And this is what he said. He said that people who did not have a will to live, people who did not necessarily have anything to live for, often died first. Meaning they could not withstand suffering because they could not see beyond the suffering. And because of that observation, he would often be able to tell which person was going to die first and which person was going to make it through the end of their sentence, or at least until they can be liberated. And this is true. Most of the time we struggle to hold on to God in seasons of difficulty and suffering because we don't see ourselves on the other side. We don't see the glory of God on the other side. We don't see how God can be magnified and glorified through this. We struggle to withstand those hard and difficult seasons in our lives because we don't see how this will shape our character and how this will mold us to be the person that God intends us to be. We don't see beyond the suffering. We don't see beyond the situation. We don't see beyond the lack. We don't see beyond the need. We don't see beyond the unanswered prayer at this moment in time. We always want to live in the present moment. And as a result, we can easily tell, or God can easily tell, I guess, using the observation of Viktor Frankl, who will likely fall away from the faith. But those who see the greater glory ahead, those who see God's splendor and God's majesty on the other side of the suffering, are the ones who are able to withstand anything that the enemy can throw at them. They become the Jobs of this time. That in the midst of suffering, can you still say that my Redeemer lives? When everyone around you say, curse God, leave God, God is not going to come through. Even the closest people that you trust, those who you regard as spiritual, those whose counsel you often regard as true. In the midst of suffering, will you prioritize God's glory and see how He's trying to mold you and shape you to become a better person in His kingdom? Or are you going to be discouraged by your situation? May God help us to see suffering differently.